The title of my presentation today is Fuego a la Lata. I don't know how many of you know what that means, but anyway, the subtitle is The Puerto Rican Experience in New York, of Mobilizing Institutions and of Institutions Mobilizing. Para el puertorriqueño, hay dos cosas sin las que no podemos vivir: el arroz blanco y la religión. And that had to be said in Spanish, because otherwise it would lose its weight. Whether on the island of our birth or in this other island that we have at one time or another called our home, we cannot live without these two staples, one to nourish our body and the other our soul. Yet while I'm sure that even the most sophisticated of our Puerto Rican scholars would hardly ever say no to un plato de arroz, for years, religion as a driving force in the making and maintenance of the Puerto Rican community in the U.S. was ignored and sometimes even negated. Thus, I am very happy and I thank you for inviting me to share with you some thoughts based on my research of the last 40 years on this subject. In my book, Oxcart Catholicism on Fifth Avenue, I adopted a socio-historical approach to study not only the reaction of the Catholic Archdiocese of New York to the Great Puerto Rican Migration, but the impact this migration had upon the Church. My focus was upon the institution and its processes of adaptation to the massive influx of Puerto Ricans between the years of 1946 and 1964, and how the people not only sought ways of adapting to the institution, but also to retain its own uniqueness, ethnic and religious identity. Those years are important because they mark the beginning of the post-war migration created by Muñoz Marin's policies and fomento. The circumstances of migration changed in 1964 because that was the year that Muñoz left the governorship for good. It was also when the social welfare legislation of the Great Society of Lyndon Baines Johnson was begun, transforming forever the landscape of urban politics for minorities. Soon to follow was passage of the Civil Rights Act and the overhaul of the immigration laws. During that 18-year period, the equivalent of 40% of Puerto Rico's population left for the US, with some 80% of these taking up residence in New York City. I was one of those Puerto Rican migrants beginning my journey from a little town called Cerro Gordo in Moca, Puerto Rico, and arriving in Washington Heights in Manhattan's West Side. My migration occurred in 1953, the peak month of the peak year of the Great Puerto Rican Migration. My life experience of religion, which began in rural Puerto Rico, was resumed in a pre-conciliar New York, continued into the radical changes of 1960s, and extended into the 1970s, when Puerto Ricans joined other Latinos and Latinas in a powerful social movement within Catholicism. I enter into this detail about church organization, theology, and politics in order to suggest that they parallel many of the social and political changes in the civil order. My dissertation, my books, and research take a social historical approach to these issues. In my presentation today, I will focus on the role of religion and Catholic institutions in the political mobilization of Puerto Ricans living in New York City. To assess how the Catholic Church as an institution acted and reacted to political mobilization for Puerto Rican migration, I preferred a comparative perspective, contrasting the New York Archdiocese and the Irish and Italians and other European American groups with Puerto Ricans. I think helps clarify the processes of advocacy and adaptation. After all, just knowing the Puerto Rican story does not offer a standard against which to measure if the Archdiocese of New York did more or less for our people that they did for other peoples as well. I chose the title Fuego a la Lata for this presentation because there's a strong element of experimentation, improvisation, and emergency in the institutional church's response and action, and so Fuego is the best way that I can explain that, because what was happening in the basement churches where Puerto Ricans were cooking up a storm in new ways of being Catholic in New York City. And sometimes, people were very, very surprised, first of all, about the fervor of Puerto Ricans, and also this sort of new kind of way of being Catholic, which the Irish and the Italians did not approve of all the time. The late Joseph Fitzpatrick would often repeat that Puerto Ricans were a breath of fresh air for the New York Catholic Church. And I would say that with our fervor and resilience, we were not only what sustained the church, but the fire that kindled its life and gave it flavor at a time when white ethnic groups such as Italians and Irish were moving to the suburbs, leaving behind many empty pews. Before the Great Migration, the Archdiocese had been inclined to identify the Puerto Rican presence as, quote, just the latest of one of the immigrant groups, and they were expected to follow the same pastoral plan with Puerto Ricans as they had for other non-English speaking groups. I would like to briefly touch upon this early strategy for absorption of the new group into the existing institution. I will then suggest that the Puerto Rican Great Migration forced a drastic change in this strategy of integration. Finally, I will outline how the reforms of the Second Vatican Council forced the Archdiocese to abandon the integration strategy. The Church did not only have to officially recognize that the experimental measures that had been implemented and the leadership that the people had demonstrated and the type of Catholicism we practice closely resembled the Council's mandates, but it also had to make these measures a permanent feature of the ministry for all people. Thus, the Puerto Rican and Latino church movements were called upon to establish new policies that transformed the church institution of New York. The Irish were the first major Catholic group to immigrate in mass numbers to New York City. This immigration was greatly stimulated by a disaster of the series of potato famines in Ireland. The Catholic Church offered a meeting place for the immigrants, provided them with the associations for finding jobs and housing, for saving money, for borrowing funds to establish businesses, and identifying political issues with the leaders to press for advocacy. In many ways, these were functions already familiar to them because the Catholic Church had provided these services under British occupation back in Ireland. Moreover, since the Irish had been forced to speak English by their invaders, they did not have a language barrier to complicate what were already significant obstacles to their success in New York City. The parishes created to serve them were homogeneous, the same people speaking the same language, which was English, with clergy from their own homeland. By the end of the Civil War, the huge number of Irish Catholics and their American-born second generations had begun to assume a central political role in deciding city elections. Not only did the people vote as a bloc, they had their own elected officials, and the clergy often served as intermediaries between the civic and the social. Just to register the magnitude of Irish dominance, remember that the first prelates in New York City was Irish, with no other national or ethnic group represented in that office even to this day. This power that the Irish Catholics were able to amass was derived in part from the ethnic cohesiveness of the parish neighborhoods that were nonetheless tied together under the authority of the Archbishop. Other language groups, like the Germans, Italians, and Slovaks, however, were also Catholic, and as they came to reside in New York, the Church sought a strategy that would at once preserve the homogeneity at the local level for the English-speaking Irish, and also impart similar benefits for organizing the other groups in their own languages. This was the origin of the national parishes, whose members were not determined by territorial lines, but by language and cultural preference. Thus, there were Italian parishes for Italians, which kept alive local customs like, for example, the San Gennaro feast, patron of Naples. The material needed for credits, unions, schools to preserve language and culture were also functions of the national parish. Yet they were under the authority of the same Irish bishop who ruled over the territorial parishes dominated by the Irish Americans. The integrated parish is the second type of parish that I want to talk about. And this was a measure which was used for Puerto Ricans Because by the time the Puerto Ricans came in 1950s, 1960s, first of all, the Puerto Ricans did not have the financial resources, and also real estate in New York City was at a premium. There was no more places to put churches at. And besides, the Irish and the Italians were leaving the inner city for the suburbs. So it was one of the measures that they thought would work would be to integrate the Puerto Ricans into the existing parishes instead of building new national parishes for the Puerto Ricans. So I'm going to skip all of that because otherwise I'll never be able to finish this whole thing. So this was a solution that Cardinal Spellman created to serve the Puerto Ricans. The Puerto Ricans then took refuge, so to speak, in the basement churches, and that's where they gave Fuego la Lata. That's when they began to really turn the church into a Hispanic, a Latino experience of Roman Catholicism. Those basement churches were so powerful and so much alive that they began with a few families, and within a couple of years they had more members down in the basement church than they had in the upper church. And I remember there were instances where the people in the upper church, the non-Latinos, would actually sneak down to the basement church because there was something happening down in the basement church that they wanted to see. And one of the other things they could not understand, and this is, I guess, in the spirit of Pentecostalism, and that we would go there, for example, at 9 o'clock, and we would be there until 3 o'clock, and they couldn't understand why people would spend the whole Sunday in church. They didn't realize that, we had a culto or the mass, whatever, and then we had the different associations, and then we would go to the school auditorium to have coffee, and then we would have the group that, the theater group, we had a theater group, for example, rehearsing something. So by the time we went home, it was 4 o'clock, 3 o'clock, and they couldn't understand, what are they doing down there? And what we were doing, we were cooking up religion. We are cooking up a new kind of Catholicism. By the time they realized what was happening, because we didn't bring priests with us. We didn't have that many in Puerto Rico to begin with. So we could hardly bring them to New York, the few that we had in Puerto Rico. So what happened then with the church the church in New York had to find ways of ministering to the Puerto Rican people, and what they began to do was to train their own Anglo priests, Euro-American priests, in Spanish language and Spanish culture. And but in the meantime, while they learned to preach, and let me tell you, believe it or not, they say women cannot preach, but I taught many priests how to preach in Spanish, and I wrote many a sermon for priests. The women, again, were the ones that kept those parishes alive. They were the catechists, they were the people, la señora what was it called? El Sagrado Corazón, las hijas de María, Legión de María, home visitors. They were the ones that kept those churches alive and thriving. So basically, the church, the basement church, before the council already experimented with lay people taking an active role in the church. And among the lay people, the ones that really did the work were the women. So this is one way. It's very interesting. Tony talked about in the parallel study how we found in the parallel study that in many parishes today, in Catholic parishes, women are the ones that are the leaders of the parish. That is because we began that work way back there. This just didn't happen after the council. This is something that happened before the council. So something that was an experiment became the norm. And I think that's very important. If I don't say anything else, here, I think that's very important for two reasons. One of them is, first of all, it highlights the role of women within the church, within Catholicism, and also it highlights the fact that something that came about because of a need that started as an experiment, how that necessity is the mother of inventions, how that which was an experiment then became the norm, not only for Puerto Ricans, for the entire church. But it took a council to tell the people, the universal church, that this was the way. We Puerto Ricans knew what was the answer from the very beginning. And this is something that began in Puerto Rico, in those campos where there were no priests, where there was no, or if there was a priest in the town and he had so many little places to go to, because it's every time, if you go, for example, Moca, you have Cerro Gordo, Plata, Voladora, you have, so many suburbs that you have to take care of. And the priest would go there once a year, perhaps. So who was going to keep alive the faith of the people? And because men usually thought that women, that religion was cosa de mujeres. And I simply, highlighted how the Crucillo movement, which began, interesting enough, in 1960s, gave also a place for Hispanics, for Puerto Ricans and Hispanics, lay people, to continue to actually enter into a more, what would I say, formal type of theological education for lay people, so that they could become lay leaders at the local level. And how the people accepted that, how the Crucillo movement thrived. It began it was brought to the local communities, the local parishes, but there was also a regional as well as a national network. So that is one of the movements that I think are important and have to be studied to understand what the role of the lay people within Catholicism was and how they impacted the church. The other organization, or rather movements that were important, there were 3 national encounters that began in 1972 and then every 5 years until 1982. And these national encounters basically did, regionally, they did what the Crucillo movement did. They began with small groups, and there was a network of small groups and meetings, and the idea was to have every so often national encounters for the whole Latino church in the United States. Those national encounters not only brought together all kinds of Latinos to meet each other, understand each other, to understand the work they were doing, and to strategize for ministry throughout the United States. But also, if you read the conclusions of those national encounters, you will find that there is a kind of pastoral theology from beneath, a theology that the people themselves were able to construct. And I think that hasn't been studied enough. Maria is saying 2 minutes. So just to conclude, if you want to read more about my studies, of course, you can always buy my book, Oscar Catholicism. By the way, I don't receive that much royalty, so I'm not doing it for that. But it explains this. Basically, what I've done in my studies, I've always looked at the question of Latinos, Puerto Ricans and Latinos, and the churches, not only the church, not only from the perspective that sociologists usually look at what has this institution, this denomination done for these people. I have always tried to look at it from the other side. What have the people done for this particular church or institution? Their presence, the way that they have related to the church, what has that done for that church, for that institution, and how has it in any way changed the institution or its theology or its pastoral outreach? Thank you.